Good morning, everybody. Today's class, I'm going to continue with what I was talking about with the economy last time, and then we're going to proceed to discussing international relations today. So we'll begin with that. Last time I left off, I'm just talking about this process of automation, which we're seeing introduced into the labor force now. I should preface this by saying that this is part of a larger process that I'm going to discuss in a couple of classes, and that has to do with the digital revolution, which is something I've mentioned previously, processes of digitization. Devote a class to that, so that's something to kind of keep in the background here as we move forward with this. So, processes of automation entering into the workforce. It's becoming increasingly likely that robots will soon flood the service industry, making an enormous array of jobs like cashiers, servers in restaurants and bars, retail clerks in stores, selling either redundant or obsolete. So think about that for a moment. Those are the kinds of jobs that are familiar to us. You yourself might have performed one of those jobs previously. But we are in development right now where the development of robotics, artificial intelligence is reaching new levels that previously would have just been the stuff of science fiction, even if we go back just a few decades. But now the technology is reaching a point where we can have robotics potentially not just perform physical tasks, but also exchanges and interactions with people. You think about these jobs, what's the level of complexity that you need in terms of interaction with a person? What kinds of questions do you ask and answer? To what degree can this technology perhaps stand in for people? Well, that's something that individuals are working on right now. That's something that companies are working on right now. And as I mentioned previously, there is an appeal of this for corporations because if you have a robot, a machine that you build and purchase, you don't have to pay it a salary. You do have to pay to maintain it, but it's not as expensive as a person. Not only that, doesn't slack off, doesn't go on strike, doesn't cause trouble at work, but just works uniformly 24/7. So you can understand the appeal of that. Indeed, this process of automation, introduction of robotics into the labor force might extend quite far. Self-driving cars, so-called robocars, that represents another part of technology that they're working on right now. Basically, a car is capable of driving itself through the streets, avoiding hazards, doing all the things that a regular driver could do, indeed doing it in a better and a safer way. And think of the numerous jobs that exist right now. Taxi drivers, truckers, delivery drivers, all of those could be rendered obsolete if these robocars ever enter mass production. Technology is still in the works right now, has to be ironed out, has to be perfected, but they are definitely developing it continuously. Again, companies would be very happy to do that because you take any of those jobs, taxi drivers, truckers, paying the salary of the worker is always the biggest expense in those kinds of jobs. You can eliminate the human element from them. It's even more significant to think about the impact just on the automotive industry in general. Think about the prospects of these self-driving cars and what that might mean for individual drivers or commuters. You think about driving to different places either within the city or even to different parts of the country. For instance, if you're going to take a trip to Aquary, we can think about the different ways you might go about getting there. You can fly, of course. You can own your own car, drive there. You can rent a car yourself. But imagine if hiring a private chauffeur was actually the most viable way to do that. In fact, the cheapest option. It wouldn't be right now. It wouldn't make sense to get a taxi and go all the way there that way. But if you have a robocar that could just drive you yourself, then that might in fact become the best way to do that. So it'd almost be like everyone gets their own kind of private chauffeur that just drives them around. Indeed, that might just replace people's general driving habits in the city. Imagine if that's a way to get around the city from point A to point B. Now, some people actually like driving for the experience of it, but for many people, it just is basically a practical thing. It might eliminate the need to even own a car. There'd be no reason to have a car. You can just dial up robocar that comes and picks you up, does so cheaply, again, because it's not a taxi. It's cheaper than that because you don't have to pay the salary of the driver. This would also be something that would cut down heavily on congestion. Wouldn't need to park these cars anywhere. No reason to park it. As soon as you get out, just drives away. How far exactly will this technology progress in the future? Well, that remains the open question, but we talk about things like the service industry, physical tasks, also types of intellectual labor. Here's something else that's been in the works for a long time. You have AlphaGo, which is an AI program, artificial intelligence program, that defeated Lee Sedol, world champion Go player, 4-1. Go is a complex strategy game, much more popular in the Eastern world than here, but it's much more complex than chess, although there has been an AlphaZero computer program that plays chess as well. And what's really fascinating about this is the sense that you have a strategy board game. It involves a lot of complex thinking and puzzle solving, and they've developed this technology, artificial intelligence technology, to the point where it can basically beat any human player at these games. I mean, Lee Sedol, that was the story. He's South Korean. It was a kind of point of national pride for him to go playing against this computer program. But he lost that series, and I think, in fact, retired from that game subsequently because he said, well, it seems as though computers are capable of defeating any human player. The other thing that Lee Sedol said that I think was interesting about that, he spoke about playing against this computer program, and he said, you know, it wasn't like playing against a machine, and it also wasn't like playing against a person. Rather, it was kind of like playing against an alien that it taught itself how to play this game. The technology has reached the point where the design is not just mechanistic, it's teaching a computer program how to actually play the game and how to strategize. Same with AlphaZero, which can defeat any grandmaster you can name when it comes to chess. So you think about the kind of implications of that. We would like to think that there are certain jobs that require in-depth thought or critical thinking or creativity that are safe from the kind of potential spread of artificial intelligence, but that might not be the case. There might not be many jobs that are safe from this if they can do them better than us in a more efficient way. Could you have robotics, artificial intelligence entering the legal profession, medical profession, entering academia, have a computer program that can digest information and put it into a narrative and deliver a lecture, a better lecture than I could give, for instance. So this is the kind of thing that is in the works right now, and we don't really know where it's going to go because we're still in the infancy, the early stages of it. So what does all this mean then for the future of labor? Well, I'm going to offer two big perspectives. I'm sure there are more than two viewpoints we can think about here, but two major perspectives to kind of weigh these issues. Say at the top there that various studies suggest that thanks to automation, up to 50% of the current jobs that exist in Britain could be phased out or at least greatly reduced in the space of a generation. So think about that. 50%, half of the jobs that exist today, including so many different jobs that I mentioned in the service industry, might not actually exist in the space of a generation because they'll all be automated or roboticized. Okay, so two major perspectives. The first says that this kind of thing, this phasing out of different jobs, the replacement of jobs, has happened before. And the second perspective says, well, every situation is unique. The first perspective, this has happened before. There you see a 13th century image of a peasant, medieval peasant. Here is something I brought up previously. The number of peasants from the Middle Ages to the mid-18th century encompassed anywhere between 85% to 95% of the population. So the overwhelming majority of the people in that world lived as peasants. If you want to frame that in a different way, you can say that this percentage of the population, quote, worked in agriculture. That was basically their industry, their job. I mentioned the thought experiment previously. The fellow falls asleep in the year 1500 and wakes up in the 2020s and looks around and sees a completely different world. And one of the kinds of things that would really strike him is probably the absence of peasants or people who work in agriculture. His thought might be, how the hell are people even eating? Right? Nobody's actually working in the industry that produces food for us. How can that possibly be? Inexplicable from that individual's perspective. Well, as it turns out, the industry has shifted considerably to the point that it's only about 1.5% of the people who work in agriculture. Those people are not peasants. Many of them are very wealthy. They own large farms and stuff like that. But if you want to say, well, that's the percentage of people who actually work in this industry. So the jobs, you could say, have been phased out or greatly reduced. And nonetheless, still, the majority of land in Britain, up to 70%, is still used for agricultural purposes. So there's still a huge amount of land that's used for growing crops, animals grazing, livestock, stuff like that. You just don't have the same number of people doing it anymore. So it's not that it's fundamentally changed on a baseline. Rather, the labor has shifted around a little bit. You can see this happening over the course of different generations, different centuries. Here you see some popular jobs in Britain that existed during the 1800s. Coachmaker, groom, farrier, coach driver, saddler, wheelwright, street sweeper. And the relevance of those is they all have something to do with horses. And that is mainly because of the use of horses for transportation in city centers. Coaches, you have the various kind of wagons, city centers. These are thus popular professions, popular jobs that exist at the time. Now, it's not to say that these jobs have disappeared altogether, but the number of people who work in these fields, these areas, certainly have shrunk, have reduced. Okay, does that mean that people have been left without jobs altogether? No, there have been migrations into other areas. Here are various jobs that did not exist in the 1800s, but did exist in the 1900s. Assembly worker in a car factory, taxi driver, bus driver, worker in sales and distribution for an automotive company, mechanic, gas station attendant. Thus, with the invention of the car, different form of transportation, thus people flow into a different industry, and you see this, as I say, across the centuries, across the generations. Politicians, of course, speak endlessly about losing jobs and creating jobs, but that is just political rhetoric when they say those things. Jobs aren't necessarily lost, they are just changed or altered over time. So that's one perspective to say, well, if it's the case that a lot of these jobs, say in the service industry, would be phased out, well, then people will migrate into other professions. It won't be the case that nobody has work. It'll rather be different forms of labor or work that start to exist very soon. The other perspective, however, would say that every situation is different, and this gets into sort of the implications of labor in the 21st century. I think what we can say with some certainty in the present moment is that labor has changed in the sense that people's professions, their jobs have become more short-term and precarious. Now, that wasn't really the case in a country like Britain just a couple of generations ago. Time was people would stick with the same company, the same corporation for the majority of their careers. Go back to, say, my grandparents' generation. You'd start in a particular company, and that would become your environment, your context. There'd be this idea of working your way up through the rungs of the company slowly over a period of decades. I don't think that's really the case today anymore. People think today, in the present context, well, I work for a particular company right now. I have a specific job, but do I really expect to be working for that same company 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road? Do we even really expect that company to be around 5 or 10 years down the road? Everything is kind of more free-flowing, and people change their professions, indeed change their careers much more rapidly than they used to. You can see this infiltrating all sorts of different sectors of life, but I put up the example of Cadbury just because it's a very telling example. That is a confectionery company famous for making chocolates, and that was the model of the, quote, job for life approach. They even provided their employees with a village in which to live. So there was this idea that if you work for Cadbury's, that is your milieu, your setting for your entire career, and the workers for the company were said to be so loyal that they bled purple. But those kinds of ideals seem to be dead. Even at a place like Cadbury, killed off when the American mega company Kraft Foods took over Cadbury in 2010. So no longer family-owned business, and no longer that principle of workers' loyalty anymore. And of course, there's nothing to prevent the company from being dissolved or repurchased further down the line. What's the trend towards then? Well, I think the trend is towards this idea of precarity, which is more a concept that we've heard about recently. It's no longer the idea of working for a single company or a single institution, building up benefits over time, building up a pension over time, but this idea of moving rapidly from one job to the next. And I think we see the development increasing with the introduction of these kinds of short-term app jobs. Here are a couple of examples of those that have come into practice recently, like TaskRabbit, Deliveroo, and Uber. These are the kinds of companies that represent the so-called gig economy, which features on-demand freelance-style work, which rarely follows a 9-to-5 schedule. And such work has come to define the precariat, meaning laborers who work inconsistent hours, have little security, and require a diverse skill set that is often only tangentially connected to their training or qualifications. So in other words, someone goes to university, acquires training, but then they end up doing something that is just a kind of a job that requires a whole bunch of different skills, and there isn't really any security to it. There isn't even really that kind of solid, tangible institution behind it. It's just like signing into an app and then you do this particular task. I think this kind of idea of having to find your own way, of having to marshal whatever skills you have and to kind of turn them into your own entrepreneurial venture, that has become much more common in this era. Think also about YouTubers as well. That's another kind of profession people get into. That too, it doesn't offer any security at all. It's just you marshaling whatever abilities you have and trying to be an independent entrepreneur. And so I think when we say, well, there will be other jobs in the future, even with the accelerating process of digitization, we have to ask what kinds of jobs exactly? What kinds of salaries, what kinds of securities, what kinds of benefits and opportunities? Because right now, I think the trend is more in this direction of precarity, of people feeling a sense of instability in their jobs and their professions. Here's a kind of interesting point that I read once, and I completely forget where I actually read it, but it resonated with me. There were polls taken of various people, different groups of people in all sorts of different countries around the world. And they were asking them all the same question: what are you looking for in the future? When you think about your career opportunities, what are you looking for in the future? And the commonest answer people gave is, I'm looking for a good job. Not just a job, but a good job. And keep in mind, of course, people's definitions of what that is can change, but nonetheless is a kind of long-standing ideal principle that people have. Okay, so now we're going to move forward and take a look at international relations. And this is also, like the lectures on the economy, going to fall into two parts. And this will be the earlier part. Here we're looking at the 1800s to the early 1900s. mentioned pairing the topics with particular centuries. This instance, we're going to take a look at the 19th century because I think that is the best era to focus on when it comes to Britain's role in international relations. So here's today's and next week's itinerary. First part, we're going to look at the historical and cultural development of imperialism. And part two will take us into the 20th century when we'll be considering World War I and World War II. So here is the historical context, what we're going to consider with aspects of imperialism, Pax Britannica, Iceland, which will provide us one case study for the 1400s, the moral venture, it's referring to imperialism, the paradoxes of Victorian society, India, which provides another case study for us to consider about British imperialism, the Atlantic slave trade, and the scramble for Africa, and the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85. So here's a point that I brought up previously and that bears repeating. The British Empire, which was a product of the Industrial Revolution primarily, though there was an empire prior to industrialization, but not a large or significant one, at least compared to some of the other European powers. It was really Britain standing at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution that inspired the growth of the empire. And this was at its peak, I mentioned this also, the largest empire in human history in terms of encompassing 25% of the Earth's population and also a quarter of the surface as well. The other point that I mentioned previously, this kind of scattershot look to the empire. We were accustomed to thinking of empires as spreading out from a single location, but in the case of Britain, it was just all around the world, everywhere except close to home. And the Victorian period was the high point of the British Empire. Between 1815 and 1914, Britain was a global superpower that presided over an era known as a Pax Britannica. That was essentially a period of peace among the great powers of Europe, which commenced with the end of the Napoleonic War. So that was basically 1815. Napoleon's attempt to construct a French empire across Europe had failed, and there followed a period of relative peace, not total peace, but relative peace in Europe. But it was peace that was set on Britain's terms because that was really the only massive global superpower that existed at that time for that 100-year period. And this is a typical story in international relations. If you see a period of prolonged peace, then there usually is that one country, that one kind of hegemonic power that presides over it, that sets peace on its own terms, that coordinates and manipulates other countries to establish its version of the global social order. Think about the role of the United States, for instance. The period since 1945, since the end of the Second World War, could be termed Pax Americana. That, of course, does not mean total peace. For instance, of course, we know about the wars that exist today, but peace compared to what had existed previously in Europe, for example. British imperialism, as I said, it had commenced previously. It only really just took off within industrialization. I'm going to provide a brief case study of Iceland in the 15th century to give a sense of where the British imperialist project might have had its roots, because this was a period, the 1400s, when there were waves of English visitors to the island of Iceland. In particular, fishermen came here in large waves at the time, and there was this sense of kind of occupying the island for a while. Another stage, or I guess we could say an initial stage, in this conflicted relationship between Britain and Iceland. Obviously, there's a lot of trade that goes back and forth between the two countries, but there have also been some quite famous disputes, like the Cod Wars in the 1970s, for instance, and the Ice Save dispute as well. So you can see this interestingly conflicted relationship. You could almost say that it might have started in the 1400s with all these English fishermen arriving in Iceland. they didn't really integrate into the culture, and it's questionable also the kind of influence, the impact that they had while they were here. Well, one impact they did have was that they kidnapped Icelandic children and brought them back to England, but nonetheless, there didn't seem to be much in the way of the interaction between the two languages. English didn't have an impact on the Icelandic language at this time, and apparently the English fishermen also did not adapt the fishing practices of the Icelanders. So it speaks to this kind of idea of a separation or a divide between them, not really integration. And then they left. I mean, this was the kind of English century. They were here, and then they left, and that was basically the end of the story, at least for now. Why is that significant? Well, because subsequently the English or the British stayed everywhere else they went. Once the empire was underway, it didn't matter how far away a place was, how obscure the place was, they just had to be there. They had to be establishing a presence and setting up their imperialist domains. And that's the reason, the explanation, why you have all sorts of various small areas, small nations, islands around the world that are to this day still part of Britain, even though they only seem to be tangentially connected to the UK. One famous example, the Falkland Islands, which are a set of islands off the coast of Argentina, where Britain established a presence. And there was actually a war fought over the Falkland Islands in the early 1980s because they're so close to Argentina that Argentina decided it would reclaim those islands. And there was a war that was fought that Britain won, and the Falkland Islands are still part of Britain to this day. And you think, why are these islands that are very close to Argentina, why are they part of the UK, right? What do they have to do with the UK anymore? It's just a legacy of the empire. That's all it is. It's just staying in these places subsequently. And so Iceland kind of forms that interesting story of, okay, it's the one place they didn't stay, right? They didn't establish the imperialist presence, and by the time industrialization was underway, they had moved on. British Empire was presented at the time by its supporters, by its apologists, as being a moral venture. And this is very typical of any one of a number of empires that you might care to name. The notion that imperialism is beneficial not only to the home country, but even more particularly to the various nations that are falling under the dominion of the empire. The British did this, and as is also typical in the perspective of the empire, there was the idea that what makes it a moral venture is the fact that it is the British Empire. Previous empires like the Roman Empire might have been corrupt and despotic, but because it's our empire, thus it becomes a beneficial thing. Beneficial in what way? Well, according, again, to the apologists, the notion of introducing their version of culture and civilization around the world. That included introducing their versions of legal and political systems all over the place, introducing the English language, which I mentioned previously. That explains why English is the most commonly spoken language in the world today. Introducing religion as well, Christianity, all the mission schools that grew up at the time, introducing English literature, Shakespeare, on and on with that of this idea of a project of uplift and support to turn it into this kind of a virtuous endeavor. Joseph Conrad, a Polish-British writer and the author of Heart of Darkness, a novel I would recommend, offers a depiction and condemnation of the moral project of imperialism. If you want to see the kind of, quote, morality of imperialism, I think Conrad's representation captures it quite well. One thing I would say at this point is the empire, first and foremost, was a commercial venture. It was about making money, and especially making money according to the dictates of the mercantile capitalist system. That's always the purpose of an empire. It is supposed to enrich the home country, and more particularly, it's supposed to enrich individuals within the home country. And that was the case of the British Empire. Anything else that would come out of it was secondary to their way of thinking. When we get into this idea of the British Empire, should focus a little bit more on the 19th century, because this will give us a really kind of interesting take on the concept of morality as it existed for the Victorians. Their version of morality, in the kind of broadest sense of the term, is not necessarily the same as our version of it today. And when you start to look closer at this idea of morality or virtue, basically means being a good person or doing good things, being benevolent. Here is where you start to see a lot of the inner paradoxes and contradictions of the British Empire, also just Victorian society as well. This is something I've mentioned previously. When you look at cultural history, you are going to see a lot of ironies and paradoxes and contradictions that emerge over time. What better place to begin than looking at the Victorian period, which is rife with that kind of stuff. Victorian era, named after Queen Victoria. There you see her dates of birth as well as her reign. Definitely a long, healthy reign. If you just hang in there for a very long time as a monarch, you will get an entire era named after you. And that's basically what she did. And Victoria, you'd have to say, is one of the most famous monarchs in British history. I'd say there are 4 monarchs in British history that have kind of entered the mainstream. So people say their names and you know who we're talking about. That would be Elizabeth I, Victoria, Elizabeth II, the one who just died recently, and Henry VIII are those. And note that 3 of the 4 are women, actually. So kind of interesting side note there. Talk about morality and you talk about paradoxes. Well, here is, right from the start, a kind of paradox that exists in Victorian society. Queen Victoria's perspective on women's rights, because a lot of the ideals of virtue and morality at the time were caught up with this notion of the place or the role of women in society, and the idea that women were supposed to be, implicitly at least, the gatekeepers of morality within society. Queen Victoria says, and here she's writing a letter in the 1870 commenting on women's suffrage. I demand to extend the vote to women. The Queen, she says, referring to herself in the third person, which was very typical, the Queen is most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this mad, wicked folly of women's rights, with all its attendant horrors on which her poor feeble sex is bent, forgetting every sense of womanly feeling and propriety. Lady Amberley, who's a famous suffragist at the time, Lady Amberley ought to get a good whipping. It is a subject which makes the Queen so furious that she cannot contain herself. God created men and women different, then let them remain each in their own position. What she's talking about there in terms of the vision of the genders, of the sexes, is the idea of them occupying completely different spheres of society. And the notion of virtue that I mentioned, women are supposed to be tasked with raising children, and in particular raising them to be good people, to be moralistic people. They are the kind of gatekeepers of morality and benevolence in society, and the implicit assumption there is that women have a better understanding of virtue and morality than men do. But note right from the start the kind of paradox or the contradiction there, because someone could say to her, well, aren't you the head of state, though? And aren't you a woman? So here you are speaking about, on the one hand, this division, and on the other hand, you are, in fact, the leader of this empire. So you see a kind of inner contradiction or paradox that emerges even in her words here. Talk about Victorian morality and contradictions, and I think the best way to sort of approach this is to focus more on this idea of these gender divisions, the ingrained misogyny of the society, and the assumptions and views of sexuality that existed at the time. Say present-day cultural associations. Now, here's something that I think has also entered the mainstream. When we talk about Victorian society and culture, there's often the assumption that this was the most prudish, buttoned-up, and repressive society you could ever imagine when it comes to questions of sexuality. That this idea of virtue and propriety was so all-pervading that nobody ever talked about sexuality, and everyone kind of confined everything to the bedroom. Nothing was open or transparent in this era. And I would say that that is a cultural association that we have today. We treat the Victorian period as though it's this kind of ground zero for kind of repression and intolerance. And since then, we have becoming progressively more open and tolerant and less repressive over time. As though it's this kind of endless process of opening ourselves up and liberating ourselves steadily. The Victorian period plays a kind of curious role in that way. How true is that? Well, I mean, it's partly true. It was certainly repressive and prudish by our standards today, but that's not to say they weren't invested or interested in talking about sexuality, because they were, in fact, talking endlessly about it during the Victorian period. This was precisely the era when there was a whole new level of dialogue around sex emerging, and it was very much a kind of scientific dialogue. Now, this was a transition that speaks to the paradigm shift I mentioned previously, because when you have a religious paradigm, well, that basically filters people's understanding of sexuality. Had done for centuries. Basically couched within the framework of Christianity, religion, that's how people are understanding sexuality. With the scientific perspective coming to prominence, thus there is more of a scientific perspective on sexuality, and there's a kind of pathologization of sexuality that starts to exist as well, meaning treating it as a kind of medical issue. For example, the existence of sexualities outside of the heteronorm, well, those things were barely acknowledged as existing in the religious paradigm. You talk about, say, queer sexuality, gay sexuality. That's couched within the language of sin, abomination, this kind of apocalyptic language. During the Victorian period, they're starting to actually see it as a practice and potentially even identity. So there's a shift in that kind of perspective. Understanding of multiple versions of a sexuality existing in dialogue and discourse. And with it comes a fear of those things. So the repressiveness of the Victorian era was, in many respects, a response to all of this new dialogue and information about sexuality. There's all sorts of people who are working precisely in the line of public morality who want to clamp down on that stuff as much as possible. So there's a fear of the kind of opening that was occurring at that time. And I think that that helps going a long way towards explaining why the Victorian era strikes us as being so repressive today. It was because there was a concerted and deliberate effort towards repression within the culture. So, the cultural associations, 2 myths and 1 fact. I'm going to present these to you to give a sense of the way people regard the Victorian era today and also the reality of the situation. So, 2 myths about the Victorian people. The first one, cover up your legs. And here is a kind of a myth that I've heard repeated. I think you could still probably find it on the internet. The idea that the Victorian era was so prudish and repressive that it was required in decent households that they would cover the legs on tables and chairs. They would have to drape them in sheets or cloth. Why would they do that? Because the idea of exposed legs was too suggestive, right? Too ribald of exposed bare legs. And I've seen that as a point that's kind of still repeated. Well, it's not true. They didn't actually do that during the Victorian era. It's just more a kind of perspective that people have on the period. Another myth that, again, I've seen reproduced, repeated on the internet. The Queen cannot believe that they would do it. The idea that there was supposed to be legislation introduced to outlaw, to ban lesbianism, to ban that as a practice, and Queen Victoria refused to sign that law into existence because she simply could not believe that women actually do those things. So she just couldn't wrap her mind around that, thus refused to sign that law into existence. Well, that's also a myth. That did not actually happen. But it gives you a sense of the sort of perspective that people had about different forms of sexuality at the time. The myth is based on a common assumption that emerged during the Victorian era, namely that lesbian practices were at best dubious because women were perceived to have no sexuality at all. That would be the kind of basis for it. So 2 women together, well, there is no sexuality in that scenario because women have no sexuality in the first place, a kind of common assumption that floated around at the time. But I should emphasize something, even speaking about that. That is very much a kind of mainstream view that would have existed. The denial of women's sexuality altogether. People who work in public morality, as I mentioned, the people who work in the kind of business of Christian virtue in society, the people who publish all sorts of works, official documents on these things, religious authorities, self-help books, which were a big thing at this time, they might reproduce that perspective. They might tell you that women have no real sexuality, but that's the mainstream conventional orthodox view. And think about present-day society. There's a lot of information that comes out of the mainstream in our culture, but do you always believe the stuff you're reading in that context? Does it always strike you as being completely accurate, or is it just this kind of one-dimensional, glossy view of things? I think it was probably similar in the Victorian period. Yes, the official sources might have told people that, but that's not to say the people in the Victorian period actually believed that was the case. And all these other practices, whether you're talking about queer sexuality, bisexuality, lesbianism, whatever it might be, yes, people knew those things existed at the time, but the official kind of moral police wouldn't acknowledge that they existed. They were in the business of repression, and all those things were kind of forced underground. In fact, there was this kind of retreat into these private spaces, secret spaces, which I'm sure would have flourished during the Victorian era. Case in point, if you have two women who are good friends, who are very close to one another, the prospect of them sleeping in the same bed, that would not have been unusual at the time. People would have done that all the time, whether in households, servants would have done it, in college dorms they would have done it. The idea of two women sleeping in the same bed, cuddling together, totally accepted at the time, because there's this idea, there's no eroticism and sexuality involved in that from the kind of mainstream perspective. But once the door is closed and the lights are out, who knows what happens in those circumstances? People just wouldn't talk about those things in the open. So yes, we'll take the break now, come back in 10 minutes.